My parents locked my sister away to protect our monster uncle. When I tried to tell the truth, my mother called me a liar. 6 years later, the recordings they thought were destroyed played in open court. The first voice everyone heard in the courtroom belonged to my mother. Not mine, not my sister's. Hers. Calm. Confident. Almost cheerful. She was telling someone that children forget eventually, that all they had to do was keep us separated long enough for people to stop asking questions. Then came my uncle's voice. Laughing. The courtroom went completely silent. My mother lowered her head for the first time in 6 years. My father closed his eyes. Across the room, my sister gripped my hand so tightly I could barely feel my fingers. Those recordings weren't supposed to exist, according to my parents. They had destroyed every copy. Apparently, they missed one. 6 years earlier, everyone believed I was the difficult child. The liar. The attention seeker. The daughter who suddenly accused a beloved uncle of terrible things for no reason. My mother made sure everyone believed exactly that. Family, neighbors, teachers, even our church. She repeated the same story over and over. That my younger sister, Lily, had developed emotional problems. That I was copying her delusions because I wanted attention. That social media had filled our heads with dangerous ideas. People believed her. Why wouldn't they? She was respected. She volunteered everywhere. Organized charity events, brought meals to sick neighbors. To the outside world, she looked like the perfect mother. Inside our house, she ruled through fear. Our uncle, David, was my father's older brother. He practically lived with us. He never married, never held a steady job. My parents always claimed he had suffered a difficult childhood and needed family support. As children, we were constantly told to respect him, help him, never question him. Looking back, I can identify the warning signs that seemed normal back then. He insisted on hugging us longer than anyone else. He found excuses to be alone with Lily. He bought expensive gifts no one asked for. Whenever one of us looked uncomfortable, my mother would smile and tell us not to be rude. She always defended him. Always. Lily was only 11 when she began changing. She stopped sleeping through the night. Started locking her bedroom door. Refused to sit beside Uncle David during family dinners. My parents called her dramatic. My father punished her for disrespect. My mother accused her of trying to divide the family. Then one afternoon, Lily disappeared. At least, that's what everyone outside the family believed. The official story was that she had suffered a severe emotional breakdown. My parents told everyone doctors recommended long-term residential treatment. They even showed relatives photographs of a peaceful-looking therapy center. People sent sympathy cards, flowers, prayers. None of them knew the truth. Lily wasn't in a treatment center. She was locked inside an old farmhouse owned by my grandparents nearly 3 hours away. No internet, no phone, no school, no visitors, only my parents and Uncle David. I didn't learn where she'd been taken until weeks later. I followed my parents after noticing they left every Saturday before sunrise. I borrowed a friend's old motorcycle and stayed far enough behind that they never noticed me. When I reached the farmhouse, I couldn't believe what I saw. Every downstairs window had metal bars. The front gate was locked with a heavy chain. I heard someone crying inside. Then I heard Lily. I ran toward the house. Before I reached the porch, my father intercepted me. He grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises for days. He told me Lily was dangerous. He said doctors ordered complete isolation. Even at 16, I knew he was lying. Doctors don't lock children inside abandoned farmhouses. That night I confronted my mother. I demanded to know what was really happening. She didn't panic. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply looked at me with complete confidence. Then she told me something I will never forget. She said some family secrets are more important than the truth. According to her, destroying one daughter's reputation was a small price to pay for protecting the entire family. I felt physically sick. I asked what Uncle David had done. She refused to answer. Instead, she warned me that if I repeated anything I'd seen, people would assume I was mentally unstable too. At first, I didn't believe her. I still thought adults would help if they knew. I went to my school counselor. I explained everything. The farmhouse. Lily. My uncle. My mother's behavior. 2 days later, my parents were waiting outside the principal's office. My mother was crying. My father looked exhausted. They handed the school paperwork claiming Lily had been diagnosed with severe psychiatric issues. Then they produced a letter. It supposedly came from a psychologist stating I had become emotionally attached to my sister's delusions. Every document looked official. Every signature appeared genuine. The counselor apologized to my parents, then gently suggested I begin therapy as well. I walked out of that office realizing something terrifying. My parents had prepared for this. Long before I ever spoke. They hadn't simply created lies. They had built an entire system designed to make the truth sound impossible, and I was completely alone. I stopped trusting adults after that meeting. Not because every adult had failed me. Because every adult with the power to help had chosen to believe my parents instead. For the next several months, I pretended to give up. I apologized to my parents. Stopped asking about Lily. Stopped arguing whenever Uncle David came over. I even acted as though therapy was helping me accept reality. My parents relaxed. They believed I had finally become obedient. That was exactly what I wanted them to think. Secretly, I started documenting everything. Every Saturday morning when my parents drove to the farmhouse. Every grocery receipt showing food being delivered there. Every unexplained cash withdrawal. Every lie they told neighbors. I hid the notebook inside an old air vent in my bedroom. Then something unexpected happened. My father bought a small digital voice recorder. He claimed he needed it for work meetings. In reality, he rarely used it. One evening, while cleaning the living room, I noticed it sitting on the coffee table. An idea came to me. Whenever my parents argued behind closed doors, they assumed I couldn't hear them. But a recorder didn't have to stand outside the door. It could stay inside. The first recording captured nothing useful, mostly complaints about bills. The second contained another ordinary argument. I almost gave up. Then, during the third attempt, everything changed. My mother and father began arguing about Lily. My father sounded nervous. He kept saying they couldn't hide her forever. My mother remained frighteningly calm. She insisted everyone already believed Lily was mentally unstable. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She explained that once enough time passed, people would remember the diagnosis, not the accusations. She believed time itself would erase the truth. A few minutes later, Uncle David joined the conversation. His voice was unmistakable. He laughed, then complained that Lily had become difficult. My father asked whether he should stop visiting the farmhouse. My mother immediately refused. She said changing routines would only make them look guilty. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the time it ended, I realized I was holding proof. Not enough to convict anyone, but enough to prove my parents had lied. Over the next 4 months, I made several more recordings. Each one revealed another piece of the puzzle. My mother coaching my father on what to tell relatives. Uncle David complaining that Lily wouldn't cooperate. My parents discussing forged medical paperwork. They even joked about how easy it had been to convince school officials. Every recording made me feel sick. But they also gave me hope. I copied every file onto 3 separate flash drives. One stayed hidden in my room. One I buried inside a waterproof container beneath an old oak tree behind my friend's house. The third, I mailed anonymously to my older cousin Sarah. I never explained what was inside. Only wrote one sentence. If anything happens to me, don't throw this away. A week later, everything collapsed. I came home from school to find my bedroom destroyed, drawers emptied, mattress cut open, closet overturned. My father stood silently in the doorway. My mother held the recorder in one hand. She smiled. Not angrily, almost proudly. She asked whether I honestly believed they wouldn't search my room eventually. Then she plugged the recorder into the fireplace. I watched the plastic melt. She threw my notebook into the flames next. Finally, she held up the flash drive I'd hidden inside the air vent. She crushed it beneath her shoe. Then she looked directly at me. She said evidence only matters if it still exists. I felt everything inside me break. Months of work, gone in minutes. That night, I cried harder than I ever had in my life. Not because I was afraid, because I believed Lily would never escape. The next morning, my parents drove to the farmhouse as usual. I stayed home. Completely numb. Late that afternoon, my cousin Sarah called. She sounded confused. She asked why I had mailed her a flash drive months earlier. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. Then I remembered. The third copy. The one nobody knew about. The one my parents had never found. I told Sarah everything. Every lie. Every recording. Every visit to the farmhouse. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she quietly asked one question. "Do you still have access to Lily?" I answered honestly. "No." Sarah told me to do exactly one thing. Say nothing. Act normal. And wait for her call. At the time, I had no idea Sarah wasn't calling the police first. She was calling someone much harder for my parents to fool. A federal investigator she had worked with years earlier during a child exploitation case. For the first time in nearly a year, someone believed me before asking for proof. And that changed everything. Sarah called me back 48 hours later. Her voice sounded completely different. Calm. Focused. Professional. She told me not to tell anyone we had spoken. Not my friends. Not my teachers. Not even Lily if I somehow managed to see her. She explained that the investigator she contacted specialized in crimes involving children and family cover-ups. Unlike local authorities, he had no connection to our town. No reason to trust my parents. No reason to protect our family's reputation. Most importantly, he had listened to every recording before speaking to anyone. His first question wasn't whether I was lying. It was whether Lily was still alive. That question hit me harder than anything else. Until then, I'd been so focused on proving the truth that I'd never stopped to wonder how much danger Lily was actually in. The investigation began quietly. For nearly 3 months, nothing seemed to happen. My parents carried on with their lives. My mother continued organizing charity events. My father went to work every morning. Uncle David still came over several nights a week. If anything, they seemed more confident than ever. They genuinely believed they had destroyed every piece of evidence. They had no idea someone was watching them. The investigators never rushed. They subpoenaed phone records, financial statements, vehicle GPS data. They compared every Saturday trip my parents made with purchases at gas stations near the farmhouse. The pattern was impossible to ignore. They also discovered something my parents hadn't expected. The psychiatric facility where they claimed Lily was receiving treatment had never admitted her. Not for one day. Not under any name. The admission papers my parents showed the school were fake. The doctor's signature belonged to a psychiatrist who had retired 2 years earlier. Then came the breakthrough. Investigators placed surveillance on the farmhouse. For 2 weekends, they watched. The third weekend, they saw Uncle David unlock the front gate and walk inside carrying groceries. No doctors, no nurses, no therapists, just my uncle. Exactly as I'd described. A search warrant was signed that same evening. I wasn't allowed anywhere near the operation. Sarah later told me that was intentional. They didn't want me witnessing what they believed they might find. The raid happened just after sunrise. By the time I woke up, my parents had already left the house. I assumed they were making their usual Saturday trip. They were. They simply didn't know 6 unmarked vehicles were following them. Around noon, Sarah arrived at my school. She signed me out early. Neither of us spoke during the drive. When we finally stopped, I realized we weren't at home. We were outside a children's hospital. Sarah turned toward me. Her eyes were full of tears. She quietly told me Lily had been found alive. I don't remember getting out of the car. I don't remember running through the hallway. I only remember seeing my little sister sitting on a hospital bed. She looked painfully thin. Her hair had been cut unevenly. She flinched every time someone opened the door. For several seconds, she didn't recognize me. Then she whispered my name. We hugged each other so tightly that neither of us could stop crying. Later that afternoon, investigators explained what they'd found. The farmhouse wasn't a treatment center. It wasn't even remotely suitable for anyone to live in. Several bedrooms had been locked from the outside. The refrigerator contained barely enough food for one person. Medical supplies were scattered across the kitchen, despite no licensed caregiver ever visiting the property. Most disturbing of all, investigators recovered handwritten schedules created by my mother. Every phone call, every meal, every permitted bathroom break. Lily's entire life had been controlled on paper, as if she were a prisoner, not a daughter. My parents and Uncle David were arrested that evening. News spread through town within hours. The same neighbors who had once praised my mother now stood outside the courthouse, staring in disbelief. Television crews filled the sidewalks. Everyone asked the same question. How could something like this happen without anyone noticing? I already knew the answer. People noticed. They just chose the explanation that felt more comfortable. Believing 2 children were lying was easier than believing respected adults could commit something so monstrous. Over the following weeks, more victims began contacting investigators. 2 cousins, a former neighbor, even a woman who had known Uncle David 20 years earlier. Each story sounded different, yet they all pointed toward the same pattern. The same protection. The same silence. My parents hadn't simply protected one man. They had helped create decades of victims by making sure nobody was ever believed. The case was no longer about our family alone. It had become something much bigger, and when prosecutors finally announced the charges, they made one thing very clear. The recordings everyone thought had been destroyed were only the beginning of the evidence. The indictment was nearly 200 pages long. When the prosecutor handed our attorney a copy, he quietly admitted he'd rarely seen a family conspiracy documented in such detail. The charges went far beyond what I had imagined. Unlawful imprisonment, child neglect, forgery, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, a conspiracy to conceal crimes against a minor, against my uncle. The list was even longer. By then, investigators had identified several additional victims dating back more than 20 years. For decades, people had whispered. No one had ever connected the stories. No, they finally did. My parents pleaded not guilty. Both of them. So did Uncle David. Their attorneys immediately began attacking our credibility. According to the defense, Lily had suffered from severe mental illness. Was supposedly seeking revenge against strict parents. The recordings, they claimed, lacked context. They insisted ordinary family conversations had been twisted into something sinister. For a brief moment, me worried people might believe them again. Then the prosecution revealed evidence none of us had known existed. The investigator assigned to our case testified that modern digital recordings leave traces. Even deleted files often survive. Forensic specialists recovered fragments from my parents' old desktop computer. Most of the audio had been corrupted. But several files remained intact. Those files matched my surviving recordings perfectly. Date. Time. Voices. Nothing had been edited. Nothing had been manipulated. The defense lost one of its strongest arguments before the trial had even begun. Then came another surprise. My mother's phone. Nesh believed she had erased everything years earlier. She hadn't. Cloud backups had quietly synchronized thousands of files before she deleted them. Investigators recovered text messages between my mother and my father stretching back years. None some discussed Lily directly. Others discussed me. None message made everyone in the courtroom visibly uncomfortable. My father had asked whether they should finally let Lily come home. My mother's reply was only one sentence. If she comes back, she'll destroy David. Reading those words on a courtroom screen felt surreal. Not because I was surprised. Because seeing evil written so casually somehow made it even worse. Another message appeared. My father asked whether they should tell doctors the truth. My mother answered that doctors asked too many questions. It was easier to keep Lily isolated. Every message confirmed the same horrifying reality. None of this had been panic. None of it had been a split-second mistake. It had been planned, maintained, repeated, year after year. During the second week of testimony, Lily finally took the stand. She was 18 now, much healthier, still nervous whenever too many strangers entered a room. The judge allowed several accommodations because of the trauma she'd endured. She didn't look toward my parents once. Not once. Instead, she focused on the prosecutor's questions. She calmly described life inside the farmhouse, how every door stayed locked, how she wasn't allowed to attend school, How letters she'd written asking for help never reached anyone. Because my mother always collected the mail first. Then Lily revealed something none of us knew. She had kept a calendar. Every day she secretly scratched tiny marks into the underside of an old wooden dresser. One mark for every day she survived. Investigators later counted them. The total matched almost perfectly with the dates prosecutors believed she had been confined. The courtroom fell silent. Then the prosecutor asked the question everyone feared. Why hadn't she tried escaping? Lily answered quietly. Because after hearing for months that everyone believed she was crazy, she eventually started wondering whether they were right. That sentence broke something inside me. The farmhouse hadn't only imprisoned her body. It had imprisoned her identity. The defense chose to cross-examine her anyway. It was a disaster. Their attorney suggested she had misunderstood ordinary family discipline. Lily didn't become emotional. She simply asked one question in return. If ordinary discipline requires locked windows and chained gates, why did investigators need bolt cutters to rescue me? No one in the courtroom moved. The attorney ended his questioning less than 2 minutes later. The following morning, it was my turn. I walked toward the witness stand knowing my parents were sitting only a few feet away. For the first time in 6 years, I looked directly at them. My father couldn't meet my eyes. My mother could. She stared at me without blinking. Without shame. Without regret. As though she still believed I would somehow protect her. She was wrong. I swore to tell the truth. Then I spent the next 7 hours telling the jury everything. The farmhouse. The fake medical records. The destroyed recorder. The threats. The lies. Every single detail. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecutor quietly nodded. Then he announced that the state had only one witness left before resting its case. The courtroom immediately became tense, because everyone knew exactly who that final witness would be. My uncle. And for the first time since his arrest, he had agreed to testify. No one expected Uncle David to testify. Not even his own attorney. Until that morning, he'd followed the same strategy as my parents. Deny everything. Say nothing. Force the prosecution to prove every detail. Then, without warning, he accepted a plea agreement. Not because he suddenly developed a conscience. Because the evidence had become impossible to escape. The agreement required him to testify truthfully against everyone involved. If prosecutors believed he lied, the deal disappeared. The courtroom was packed when he entered the witness box. Reporters filled every available seat. Even people who had never met our family waited outside, hoping to hear what happened. For the first time in my life, my uncle looked frightened. Not angry, not arrogant, afraid. The prosecutor started with simple questions. His name, his age, his relationship to my parents, and then everything changed. He asked whether Lily had ever been admitted to a psychiatric hospital. No. The answer came immediately. No. Hesitation. No. Excuses. Then he asked who decided to keep Lily at the farmhouse. Uncle looked toward my parents. Neither of them looked back. Finally. And he answered. And my mother. And according to him, the very first discussion happened around our dining room table. He claimed my mother insisted Lily's accusations would destroy the family forever. Ninch believed no one would ever forgive them if the truth became public. And my father initially refused. Ni argued they should contact lawyers. Doctors. Nen someone anyone. But my mother convinced him that once authorities became involved, everything would be over. Their reputations. Their jobs. Their church. Their family name. She told them they had only one choice. Make everyone believe Lily was mentally unstable. The prosecutor asked whether my father ever physically forced Lily into the farmhouse. Uncle quietly nodded. Admitted something that made several jurors visibly flinch. Nellie begged to go home. She screamed that she'd done nothing wrong. My father cried while locking the door. But he locked it anyway. The prosecutor didn't interrupt. He simply let the silence fill the courtroom. Then he asked about me. My uncle admitted my mother considered me the bigger problem. And according to him, she believed I was too stubborn to manipulate forever. That's why she forged psychological reports about me. And Shay wanted people to doubt me before I ever started speaking. And every accusation I'd made as a teenager had been anticipated and planned neutralized before I even opened my mouth. Then came the recordings. And the prosecutor played another clip the jury hadn't heard before. And my mother's voice echoed through the courtroom. She calmly explained that once enough professionals believed the girls were unstable, no jury would ever trust them. She laughed softly afterward. Actually laughed. The sound made my stomach turn. When the recording ended, no one moved. Not even the judge. Then the prosecutor asked Uncle David the final question. "Why are you telling the truth now?" For the first time during his testimony, he cried. He admitted prison terrified him. Growing old terrified him. But there was something that frightened him even more. The possibility that another child would suffer because everyone stayed silent again. I didn't know whether to believe him. Maybe he was sincere. Maybe he simply wanted a lighter sentence. At that point, his reasons no longer mattered. The truth did. The defense immediately began cross-examination. They tried to paint him as a desperate criminal willing to blame innocent people. Then they made a mistake. They suggested my mother had always tried to protect children. The prosecutor objected. The judge overruled. He wanted to hear the answer. My uncle slowly turned toward the jury, then quietly said something that destroyed the defense's entire theory. He admitted that my mother had never once asked whether Lily was safe. Not once. Her first question after every visit to the farmhouse was always the same. Did she say anything that could get us caught? Not. Was she eating? Not. Was she healthy? Only. Whether the secret was still safe. The defense had no recovery after that. When Uncle David stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom remained completely silent. The prosecution rested its case. The defense called only 2 witnesses. Both were character witnesses who described my parents as generous members of the community. Years earlier, that testimony might have mattered. Now, it sounded painfully empty, because the jury had already learned the hardest lesson of the entire trial. Sometimes the people who appear kindest in public work the hardest to hide what happens behind closed doors. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning. As everyone stood to leave, I looked across the courtroom one last time. My mother was staring directly at me. Not with anger, not with sadness, with disbelief. As if she still couldn't understand why the lies that had protected her for 6 years had finally stopped working. The next day, 12 strangers would decide whether our family would ever be free from the people who destroyed it. And for the first time since Lily disappeared, I wasn't afraid of the verdict. I was only waiting to hear it. The jury returned after just 5 hours. For a case that had lasted nearly 7 weeks, that was remarkably fast. Everyone stood as they entered the courtroom. I couldn't look at my parents. Instead, I stared at the edge of the witness stand where I'd spent 7 hours telling the truth no one had believed for 6 years. The foreperson handed the verdict forms to the bailiff. The silence felt endless. Then the clerk began reading. Against my uncle. Guilty. On every major count. Against my father. Guilty. Unlawful imprisonment. Conspiracy. Evidence tampering. Child neglect. Forgery. Against my mother. The clerk paused. Then continued. Guilty on every single charge. No one reacted immediately. It was almost as if the courtroom needed a few seconds to understand what had happened. My father quietly lowered his head into his hands. He never looked up again. My mother didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She simply stared straight ahead. Even after 6 years, she still looked convinced someone else had betrayed her. The judge scheduled sentencing 1 month later. Before dismissing the jury, he thanked them for their service. Then he said something that every reporter quoted the next morning. The greatest danger to children is not always the person who commits the first crime. Sometimes it is the adult who decides protecting the criminal matters more than protecting the child. No one in the courtroom disagreed. At sentencing, victims from 3 different decades spoke. People we'd never met. Some were now in their 40s. Others had grandchildren of their own. Many admitted they had stayed silent because they believed no one would ever believe them. Listening to their stories was heartbreaking. It also answered a question that had haunted me for years. Why had Uncle David never stopped? Because every time someone tried to tell the truth, Someone else protected him. The chain had lasted for decades, until now. When it was Lily's turn to speak, the courtroom became completely silent. She walked slowly to the podium. She carried no notes, no prepared speech. She simply looked toward the judge. Then she said something none of us expected. She wasn't angry that her childhood had been stolen. She was angry that her older sister had been forced to spend 6 years fighting alone because adults refused to listen. I felt tears running down my face before I realized I was crying. For years, I'd blamed myself. I thought I hadn't been brave enough, hadn't spoken loudly enough, hadn't saved her quickly enough. Hearing Lily say that lifted a weight I'd carried since I was 16. Then it was my turn. I didn't talk about revenge. I didn't ask for harsh punishment. Instead, I spoke about trust. Children are born believing adults will protect them. That belief is one of the most precious things they have. When adults betray that trust, the damage doesn't end when the crime ends. It follows them into every relationship, every friendship, every decision. For years, I questioned every kind adult who entered my life. Teachers, doctors, even people who genuinely wanted to help. Because once trust is broken that deeply, it doesn't magically return. The judge nodded quietly. Then he delivered the sentences. My uncle received decades in prison. The judge stated he would almost certainly spend the rest of his life there. My father also received a lengthy prison sentence. Before deputies escorted him away, he finally looked toward Lily. He tried to speak. She gently shook her head. He understood. Some apologies arrived too late. Then my mother stood for sentencing. Even then, she refused responsibility. She insisted she'd only been trying to keep the family together. The judge interrupted her. He explained that protecting a family never requires sacrificing a child. The moment she chose reputation over her daughters, she stopped protecting her family. She destroyed it. He imposed one of the longest sentences allowed under the law. As deputies handcuffed her, she finally turned toward me. For the first time in years, she looked afraid. Not because of prison, because she realized she no longer controlled the story. The truth belonged to everyone now. Life afterward wasn't magically perfect. Just as close as court cases. It doesn't instantly heal trauma. Lily spent years in therapy. So did I. Some nights she still woke from nightmares. Sometimes loud door locks made her panic. Sometimes I still caught myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault because I'd spent years believing every problem somehow began with me. Healing wasn't a straight line, but it happened. One ordinary day at a time. 2 years later, Lily graduated from college. She chose to study psychology, not because she wanted to relive the past, because she wanted to become the adult she desperately needed when she was 11. Someone who listened before judging. Someone who believed frightened children instead of searching for reasons to dismiss them. Watching her walk across that stage remains one of the proudest moments of my life. As for me, I eventually began speaking at conferences for child protection professionals, judges, teachers, counselors, police officers. I always ended with the same message. Children rarely invent detailed stories that destroy their own lives. But adults often invent comfortable explanations that allow them to ignore those stories. Believe carefully. And investigate thoroughly. But never dismiss a child, simply because the accused adult seems respectable. Predators often survive behind good reputations. 9 years later, I received one final package. It came from the courthouse after the appeals process ended. 9 side was the original digital recorder investigators had recovered from evidence. The same model my parents believe they had destroyed. Attached was a note from the prosecutor. He wrote that this small device had become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Not because it captured every crime. Because it captured the beginning of the truth. And he placed it in a drawer at home. Not as a trophy. Nas a reminder. And truth is fragile. And then sometimes it survives only because one frightened teenager decides to press record. Instead of giving up. N people often ask whether I hate my parents. N the answer surprises them. Ni don't. Hatred would keep them living in my heart forever. N what I feel instead is something quieter. Nistance. An acceptance. And an unshakable certainty that family is not defined by blood. N family is defined by the people who protect you when protecting you costs them something. N Sarah became my family. N the investigators who believed us became family. N the therapist who helped Lily reclaim her life became family. N the friends who stood beside us after the trial became family. N blood created our past. N choice created our future. N looking back, people think this story is about the recordings played in court. N they're wrong. N the recordings didn't win the case. N they simply gave the truth of voice. N the real victory happened the moment Lily realized she was never crazy. N the moment I realized I had never been a liar. And the moment 12 strangers looked at two frightened sisters and said the words we'd waited 6 long years to hear. We believe you. After everything that had been stolen from us. Those 3 words gave us something no prison sentence ever could. Our lives back.